You're watching A News. I'm Bakhtiar Sanov, and let's begin with the top headlines making news around the world. Iran warns it could go on the offensive in the Strait of Hormuz if diplomacy with Washington fails. President Donald Trump's Middle East envoy Jared Kushner leaves Jerusalem with no breakthrough over the war in Gaza. And Turkey's Erdoğan and the US president discuss bilateral ties by phone after Donald Trump welcomes the new regional Mecca Defense Pact. Iran says it's moving towards a more aggressive military position after efforts to reach a permanent settlement with the United States stalled. The warning comes as Tehran and Washington remain locked in a dispute over the expired Islamabad memorandum after the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz.
Iran says it will shift to a fully offensive military posture after efforts to negotiate a permanent end to the war with the United States stalled. A senior Iranian official told Reuters that Tehran would carry out a timely and precise military operation to break the US naval blockade on Iran. The official said Washington must meet all provisions of the Islamabad-brokered Memorandum of Understanding within weeks before further negotiations can continue. The memorandum, signed by Iran and the United States in June, outlined a framework to end military operations and reach a final settlement. It expired on June 17th, with both sides accusing each other of failing to comply with its terms. Iran's foreign ministry says no talks have begun, although discussions on sanctions relief and nuclear issues could have been extended if no final deal was reached. Iran and Oman had agreed on a navigation route through the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran and Washington remain divided over control of the strategic waterway, with Iran claiming the right to manage the strait under the memorandum, a position rejected by Washington. US President Donald Trump said his country was not seeking to extend the agreement, claiming Iran's military had been totally defeated and reiterating that Tehran would never be allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon. Trump also criticized Oman over its role in talks on reopening the Strait of Hormuz, saying the country had not behaved very well, but that Washington could handle the situation easily. Meanwhile, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan called for maximum use of diplomatic opportunities and said Ankara would continue supporting efforts aimed at achieving peace. During his phone call with Donald Trump, Erdoğan added that the joint defense agreement signed with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia would contribute to regional stability and security.
Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps has stressed that the Strait of Hormuz will not reopen before the U.S. fulfills its obligations under the Islamabad Memorandum. The IRGC has also rejected Donald Trump's claim that his administration is communicating with the group through a back channel. Turaj Shiralullah has more from Tehran.
The Islamic Revolution Guards Corps of Iran, IRGC, has warned that it will not reopen the Strait of Hormuz to maritime traffic as long as the U.S. does not carry out its obligations under the interim peace deal, which expired on Monday. IRGC's political deputy commander, General Yadullah Javani, in an interview with the state IRIB TV, also said that the so-called middle corridor at the strait, to be agreed between Iran and Oman, will be activated only after the war between Iran and the U.S. terminates. Meantime, the Revolutionary Guard's spokesman, Hossein Mohebbi, dismissed U.S. President Donald Trump's remarks regarding secret negotiations with IRGC officials about war, calling the statements, I quote, delusions born out of desperation and defeat. He added that even Iran's foreign ministry is not currently negotiating with the United States because of what he called Washington's breach of promises. Also, Foreign Ministry spokesman Ismail Baghai denied certain media reports about unofficial contacts between Washington and the IRGC via Iraqi Kurdistan officials and an alleged secret US-Iran meeting in Erbil. Speaking at a weekly press conference on Monday, he said the news was media techniques and psychological operation used to sow discord among Iran's decision-making bodies. Earlier, Fox News had reported that Trump confirmed there was a back channel for peace talks between Washington and the Revolutionary Guards. The Foreign Ministry spokesman also ruled out a 60-day deadline in the ceasefire agreement between Iran and the US signed in June, saying the peace talks under the deal did not start because the US resumed attacks and violated its provisions. Turaj Shiralilu from Tehran for A News.
Oil markets are edging ahead as uncertainty over the conflict in the Middle East continues to weigh on traders and investors. Here's the latest on oil prices and the wider impact of events in the Gulf on the financial markets.
Oil prices moved higher on Tuesday as hopes of a US-Iran peace deal weakened, raising concerns over possible disruptions to global energy supplies. Brent crude rose 27 cents, or 0.3%, to around $91 a barrel after reaching its highest level since late July in the previous session. The uncertainty also weighed on US markets. Wall Street's three main indexes ended lower on Monday. The S&P 500 fell 0.5%. The Dow Jones lost around 0.5%, while the Nasdaq dropped 0.3%. Progress towards peace talks and the resumption of oil tanker traffic through the strategically important Strait of Hormuz has slowed. Only 5 commodity vessels transited the strait on Saturday after attacks on tankers, and there were none registered for Sunday versus 31 in the prior weekend. That's according to ship tracking data from Kepler showed. But any prolonged disruption could put further pressure on oil supplies and prices.
President Donald Trump's Middle East envoy Jared Kushner has left Jerusalem without a breakthrough over the war in Gaza. That's despite 2 days of talks with Israeli and Hamas leaders over the stalled U.S. plan to end the conflict. Both sides are standing firm on key demands. Nick Harper has more from Washington.
2 high-stakes meetings in 2 days. Jared Kushner, the US envoy, and President Donald Trump's son-in-law had the task of trying to get the US peace plan for Gaza back on track. The talks were brokered to try and break the impasse, with neither Israel nor Hamas keeping their respective commitments. And after the Israeli Prime Minister earlier this month roundly rejected the plan, continuing attacks on Gaza and refusing to withdraw Israeli troops from the enclave. On Sunday, Kushner met Hamas's political leader, a rare direct meeting, which we're told was very productive. Hamas committed to fully disarm and cease immediately all military activity. However, since last year's peace plan was agreed, the group has taken no tangible steps to handing over their arms. Since then, behind the scenes, Trump's Board of Peace has been trying to advance the plan. After Kushner's Monday meeting in Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu's office released a statement saying they had a deep and constructive discussion. They agreed to establish 2 working groups, one on disarmament and demilitarization of Gaza, and the other on sanitation and public health issues in Gaza. However, no immediate promise to withdraw Israeli troops or show trust in Hamas's disarmament commitment. And they agreed the reconstruction of Gaza would not start until Hamas fully disarmed. Earlier, 8 foreign ministers from Arab and Muslim-majority nations condemned Israel's refusal to accept the US-backed roadmap for Gaza, warning it would derail prospects for a lasting settlement. So, no major breakthrough from Kushner's trip, just more promises to uphold commitments and have more meetings to try and advance peace. Netanyahu is up for re-election in October, and it seems unlikely the Israeli leader will make any major Gaza concessions before then. Nick Harper for A News in Washington, D.C.
Washington says it will not support reconstruction in Gaza until Hamas gives up its weapons. Israel is demanding complete demilitarization before any military withdrawal. Jared Kushner's latest meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu produced working groups, but as we have heard, no breakthrough. To discuss the latest developments, we are joined by Brigadier General in Reserve Erez Weiner, chairman of the IDSF, who joins us from Ramat Gan, Israel. Mr. Weiner, thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Weiner,
Hello.
hello. Jared Kushner says reconstruction cannot begin until Hamas is demilitarized. How realistic is it to make reconstruction conditional on disarmament, given the scale of Gaza's humanitarian needs?
Well, Israel doesn't have any interest starting the reconstruction in Gaza. Israel's interest is that Gaza will no longer become a threat to Israel, like we saw on October 7th and many, many years before that. So from the Israeli perspective, the best thing, and I think that the most relevant and most fair solution will allow citizens of Gaza to live. It's a disaster area by all means. The number of tunnels, the destruction, the explosives that there are everywhere. They're all in such a condition that it will take more than a decade to reconstruct, even when it starts. So the best thing how those people, like happened in any other disaster area in the world, to live and to find themselves a better place that they could reconstruct their life and families. But for those who will stay, and for the terms of the 20 points agreement, I think it was said loud and clear yesterday by Ambassador Kushner and by the Peace Council CEO Meradanov, that things has to happen as it was decided. First, Hamas will have to totally disarm from their weapons, and only after they do that, we will talk about the next phase.
Mr. Weiner, what would complete demilitarization actually mean in practice?
Demilitarization is a very tricky word, because in order to demilitarize and de-radicalize society, that for decades, all what they know and all what they learn and all what they were dealing with was hatred against Israel and against Jews, terrible incitement. When we were passing through the houses in Gaza, in every house almost, or at least in every second house, you would find weapons, explosives in bedrooms, in kindergartens, in hospitals, in clinics. In every house you saw a map of Israel without Israel, only Palestine. You saw pictures of Jerusalem without any Jewish presence whatsoever. So the amount of incitement and the hatred is deep inside the population in Gaza. You have to start from somewhere. You have to start from having a new system after many years of UNRWA teaching them and taking part of this incitement and hatred. You have to start new system, new education system, new books, new teachers. You have to guide those new teachers. So we are talking here in a very, very long process that, again, a decade might look a short time.
Jared Kushner has suggested that tangible progress on removing weapons could begin within about 30 days. How achievable is that timeline?
I think that Kushner and the Board of Peace are very optimistic, and it's good to be optimistic. I'm not sure that they are realistic, because in order to start all of those procedures, you have to have Hamas cooperation. And I don't see Hamas cooperate for the time being. So unfortunately, we will all be very happy to be in a position that Hamas will be disarmed and that the people in Gaza could live peacefully and quietly their life. But I think that before that will happen, what can happen and what will happen much faster is that the Israel, with the support of the ISF, that actually today the first soldiers of of that organization are getting into Gaza and into their base today. To start to move people from under the control of Hamas to areas that Israel already cleaned from explosives, from any danger, from tunnels and so on, and let the people of Gaza live their life without Hamas holding them by the throat. I think that this is something that is more realistic and could happen in a much shorter terms.
Mr. Weiner, Benjamin Netanyahu has reportedly raised political concerns ahead of Israel's October election. How much is domestic Israeli politics influencing his position on the Gaza roadmap?
Well, of course, the coming election are putting everything in a much higher noise. Every discussion about Gaza, every discussion about, like we saw in the last couple of weeks, when the 15 points agreement is actually an agreement between Hamas and the Board of Peace. Israel has nothing to do with this agreement whatsoever. Israel has to authorize eventually that Hamas did what he was supposed to do under the 20 points agreement. But the pressure before the election, the mutual, let's say, suspicious, didn't support any advance in the short term that we had before the elections. So we'll basically will have to wait and see what will be our position after that.
So the latest talks produced agreement on working groups dealing with disarmament and public health. Could these technical mechanisms help overcome the broader political deadlock?
Yeah, Israel is showing good faith. When the Board of Peace asked us 2 weeks ago to stop and targeting Hamas members of the massacre on October 7th, we did. The deal was that Hamas will stop mutually their training, their reconstruction, and the rebuilding of their tunnels. When they failed to do so, Israel went back to target those Hamas terrorists. So Israel will be in good faith, will take part in every group of thinking, of building, of constructing. Personally, I don't see Hamas playing alone. So we will try harder, and then eventually Hamas will prove us all right or wrong, depending from what perspective you look.
Mr. Weiner, the United Nations, the European Union and World Bank estimate that Gaza will need around $71.4 billion for recovery and reconstruction over the next decade. Who could realistically finance such a massive rebuilding program?
No program is relevant, and any money that will be put inside Gaza today is a wasted dollar. Hamas is there. As long as the military and the leadership of Hamas is there, it will all goes back again, like it did after the disengagement, when Israel totally left the area. Like it happened in a decade or more, that Israel have left Gaza to deal with their own life, that the world has spent billions of dollars on Gaza. And eventually they taken this money and building more tunnels, building more weapons. They don't build education, they don't build malls and infrastructures for industry. So any money that we put today will be a waste, and the only chance to this story in Gaza is there are two solutions, or two parts of one solution. One is getting rid of Hamas totally as a movement and as a military organization. And the second is, as I said, to allow those who want to emigrate from this disaster area of Gaza to better places.
So in your view, what role can Egypt, Qatar, Turkey and other regional actors play in guaranteeing that both Hamas and Israel fulfill their commitments? If possible, briefly.
Well, Qatar and Turkey and also Egypt, in a way, are not exactly Israel friends. They all want the problem to stay our problem. They don't want a solution to the people of Gaza. They don't want better life for the people of Gaza. They want Israel to keep suffering from this thorn in her throat, and that's why they want to keep the situation as it is. And instead of talking about next phase and what can we do and how can we do, as I said, it will take more than a decade. Allow those people to leave Gaza for this decade, and hopefully when things will be better and everything will be flourish and reconstruct, then they could come back to a better place after being re-educated. But for the time being, I don't see anyone who wants to help the Gazans. I see everyone, including these countries that you've mentioned, they all want just one thing, that Israel will suffer more, and they don't care that the Gazans suffers as well.
Erez Wiener, thank you very much for talking to News. We greatly appreciate your time and insights. Thanks a lot.
Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney says he plans to speak with President Donald Trump before August 19th, when Washington's 50% tariffs on Canadian exports are due to take effect. Canadians fear the tax hikes could cause job losses in industries that are already struggling and could also complicate broader negotiations over the future of North America's free trade agreement. Last month, Donald Trump refused to extend the deal for another 16 years. On Monday, Canada's minister responsible for bilateral U.S. trade stepped up talks with his counterpart in Washington.
The long-standing issues.
U.S. President Donald Trump's approval rating has dropped to its lowest point in his current term, according to new figures by the pollsters Ipsos Reuters. Only 33% of Americans surveyed backed his performance in the White House, while 64% disapprove. That's down from 35% earlier this month. It matches the lowest approval rating of his previous term, recorded in December 2017. The poll also found 80% of Americans expect U.S. involvement in the war with Iran to continue for an extended period, including 87% of Democrats and 71% of Republicans. After the break, Russia warns the UK of consequences after claims that British-made drones are being used in Ukrainian strikes. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching A News. Russian authorities say another wave of Ukrainian drone attacks have targeted Moscow and the surrounding region, including a warehouse owned by the online retailer Wildberries. Moscow says hundreds of Ukrainian drones were brought down overnight. In Ukraine, several people were killed in the Kharkiv area.
A Russian missile strike has killed at least 10 people and injured 8 others in Ukraine's northeastern Kharkiv region, according to regional authorities. The strike hit the village of Pechenihi, damaging at least 10 private homes, as well as a cafe, post office, shop and several vehicles. Meanwhile, a large-scale Ukrainian drone attack targeted Moscow and surrounding areas overnight. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin said 180 drones were shot down after around 620 were reported to have been heading toward the region. Drones also struck a Wildberries warehouse near Moscow, killing 1 person and injuring 3 others in the area, according to regional authorities. Several other buildings, including homes, shops and a power facility, were also damaged. Russian-controlled Crimea also reported power outages following overnight drone attacks. The latest exchanges come as both sides continue to carry out long-range strikes against military, industrial and infrastructure targets across the conflict zone.
Russia has warned the UK of possible consequences after reports that British-made drones were used in Ukrainian strikes on targets inside Russia. The Russian embassy in London said the UK would have to answer for its support of Ukraine. Prime Minister Andy Burnham says the UK's position is to support Ukraine as 100% against what he called this illegal war. The UK Ministry of Defence said Britain stands shoulder to shoulder with Kiev and will continue providing equipment for the military effort. The warnings from Moscow come as Ukraine steps up long-range drone strikes against military and energy-related targets inside Russia. Belgium is battling its biggest wildfire on record, with around 3,000 hectares of land destroyed in the east of the country. However, sudden cooler temperatures are helping firefighters contain the blazes. Anita Sharma has more.
Welcome to this day in Europe, where rain and cooler temperatures finally help firefighters gain ground against the biggest wildfire ever recorded in Belgium. The blaze has burned around 3,000 hectares of the High Fence Nature Reserve in eastern Belgium since Friday, following intense heat that pushed temperatures as high as 37 degrees Celsius. Approximately 500 firefighters from Belgium, Germany, and Luxembourg, backed by the military, farmers, and international crews, have been battling the flames, with aircraft also deployed through the EU's emergency response system. And there are now signs the situation is improving. Belgian officials say parts of the blaze have been contained and the fire is no longer spreading towards the German border. But authorities say they cannot yet declare the overall fire contained. The biggest challenge may now be underground, where fire is smoldering deep in the high fence peat bogs and could burn for months. What started the blaze remains unclear. Human activity is responsible for roughly 90% of wildfires, whether through campfires, discarded cigarettes, or other causes. And Belgian prosecutors are now investigating how this fire began. It comes after Europe experienced its worst wildfire season on record last year, when more than 1 million hectares burned. This year is already breaking records in some countries, including France, with the traditional fire season still weeks from ending. Frustration boiled over Monday in the southwestern French village of Le Porge, where hundreds of homes were destroyed by a massive wildfire last month. Residents booed Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu, accusing authorities of doing too little while protecting wealthier communities. As the fire spread, so too does the political anger, it seems. For A News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
Nearly 500 people have been evacuated to safety in Costa Rica due to heavy rainfall. The country's National Emergency Commission says overflowing rivers have cut off whole communities. Rescue teams helped residents move to shelters in Cartago, Limon, and Sarapiqui after tropical wave number 32 brought torrential downpours over the weekend. Local flooding is reported along with road closures and disruptions to public services, mainly in northern areas along the Caribbean coast. China is warning of a potentially record-breaking Super El Niño, with sea temperatures in the Pacific expected to rise steadily in the month ahead. The forecast comes as the country grapples with a summer of floods, landslides, and typhoons.
China's National Climate Center says the emerging El Niño could become the strongest ever recorded. Sea surface temperatures in the central and eastern equatorial Pacific are expected to rise steadily, peaking around November and December. The Climate Center says China has already seen the effects of the phenomenon since the start of summer, including torrential rain in several regions. Rain belts have sometimes overlapped, compounding disasters, while typhoons have been strong and active, bringing prolonged winds and rainfall. Last week, Typhoon Dolphin, the strongest typhoon to hit the country this year, unleashed extreme rain across eastern, central, and northern regions. The government says natural disasters in July left more than 300 people dead or missing and incurred around $8.5 billion in direct economic losses. The forecast comes as China deals with a series of deadly weather-related disasters. Last month, flash floods triggered landslides in northwestern Gansu province, killing 25 people. Another landslide in Chongqing left 51 dead after a mountain collapsed. President Xi Jinping has called for stronger disaster prevention, monitoring and early warning systems, as well as efforts to address gaps in flood control and drainage infrastructure. The United Nations Weather Agency has also raised its forecast for a strong El Niño in the coming months, warning the phenomenon is likely to drive global temperatures higher.
The losses from Colombia's powerful earthquake last week have been put at 32 trillion pesos. That's around 9.6 billion US dollars. Colombia's president said the losses mainly affected buildings and vital infrastructure. The 7.4 magnitude quake struck western Colombia a week ago, killing at least 280 people, injuring more than 4,000, with others still missing. Buildings were brought down in several areas in the cities of Cali and Pereira. The scale of the damage is still being assessed as rescue and recovery efforts continue.
There's already an initial technical estimate of the economic impact of this entire disaster. A private firm estimated direct property damage in Choco, Valle del Cauca, Risaralda, Quindio and Caldas at nearly 30 trillion pesos, approximately 24.5 trillion in buildings and 5.5 trillion in infrastructure. Just imagine the scale of the disaster.
3 people have been killed after a private helicopter crashed shortly after takeoff on the Greek island of Sifros on Monday, according to the Greek fire service. The aircraft came down near homes in the Tolos area and caught fire. The victims were reportedly the pilot and the British couple who had recently married. The cause of the crash remains unknown, and an investigation is underway. Zambia's President Hakainde Hichilema has secured a second term after winning the presidential election with around 60% of the vote. The result comes after a campaign marked by opposition allegations of fraud and concerns over political conditions.
There were celebrations from supporters of Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema in the streets of the capital Lusaka in the early hours of Tuesday after he was re-elected for a second term. Results released by the country's election commission showed that Hakainde Hichilema received roughly 60% of valid votes, compared with 38% for his main challenger Brian Mundubile. It was Hichilema's 7th run for the presidency, and he was widely expected to win due to the advantages of incumbency, while it was Mundubile's first bid to become head of state. Hichilema's campaign focused on economic reforms. Speaking before securing his second term, he acknowledged that many Zambians continued to face hardship due to the high cost of living.
We have done many things, yes, but there's a lot of more work to be done. Are we together? Yes. Life is still challenging. Life is still challenging for a lot of our people. A lot of our families still need a support that is beyond what we are delivering today.
However, the vote was marked by controversy, with opposition parties alleging fraud and accusing the government of restricting political space ahead of the vote. The counting was temporarily suspended nationwide after attacks on election officials and the theft of marked ballot papers. International and domestic observers said the conditions contributed to an uneven playing field. Authorities arrested nearly a dozen people on the night of the election, including senior opposition figures, during a raid involving an exchange of gunfire. The government said those detained were linked to militia or insurgent activity, allegations rejected by opposition.
Liechtenstein is changing its succession rules to allow the firstborn child, regardless of gender, to inherit the throne. Hereditary Prince Alois said the changes would give male and female descendants equal rights under the princely house rules. The amendment replaces male preference succession with absolute primogeniture, meaning the eldest child will become the future prince or princess. Alois said the move aims to ensure leadership remains with the person best prepared for the role. After the break, we'll look at more stories shaping the region. Stay tuned. Welcome back to News. Now to Afghanistan, where the National Power Utilities says it has discussed preliminary assessments of major power plants with Russia's Power Machines company. Tamim Bahis reports.
The Afghanistan Brezhna Shirkat or DABS Chief Executive Abdul Haq Hamkar has held talks with a technical delegation from Russia's Power Machines company. The Russian delegation presented its initial assessments of a number of existing power generation facilities, including Mahipur and Parwan. According to DABS, the assessments identified the need to increase generation capacity at some plants, make technical modifications, modernize equipment and carry out more comprehensive studies. DABS Chief Executive said conditions are now in place for investment in Afghanistan's power generation and infrastructure upgrades. He said Power Machines could consider investment once the required preliminary technical stages are completed. DABS also says that during approximately the past 5 years, efforts have been made to attract foreign investment for the rehabilitation of existing power plants. For now, these discussions remain at the technical assessment stage, with further studies expected to determine the scope of possible rehabilitation and investment. Tamim Bahis, Kabul, A News.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan has urged Donald Trump to pursue talks with Iran to de-escalate tensions between the two countries. In a phone call between the two leaders, Erdoğan stressed bilateral ties with the United States and offered Ankara support for peace efforts between Washington and Tehran. They also discussed the war in Gaza and the defense pact between Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. Erdoğan said the accord shows a strong stance in ensuring regional stability and security. He also said that Ankara will continue to support tangible steps for Gaza's reconstruction. Earlier, we spoke with Bekir İlhan from Turkey Research Foundation about Turkey's growing diplomatic activism and its efforts to build regional conditions. Let's have a look.
Yeah, I would say looking at the recent foreign policy activism of Turkey, I would say that, Turkey is building coalitions, building diplomatic coalitions. And we have seen these examples in crisis in Gaza and crisis in Iran, as well as the recent agreement between Turkey, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, I'm talking about Mecca agreement. Yes, as I said, Turkey is building coalition because Turkey seeks stability and peace in the region. At this point, I would say, for example, take a look at the crisis in Gaza. Turkey built a coalition or the diplomatic coalition. Consists of Qatar, Pakistan, Indonesia, and other Muslim countries, major Muslim countries, and at the United Nations, General Assembly, major Muslim country leaders, held a meeting with President Donald Trump, and after that, there was a negotiation process between Israel and Hamas, and at the end of the day, we got a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. Right now, of course, sometimes occasional attacks from Israel happens, but at the end of the day, we have a ceasefire, and similarly. Turkey also tries to build a diplomatic coalition to resolve the crisis in Iran as well. Qatar, Pakistan, and Turkey are taken active part to, maintain diplomatic channels between the United States and Iran as well. And for now, as you said, that Mecca agreement is a recent example of this process. I would say, Turkey, build a, alliance right now. I would say it's more than a diplomatic coalition; it's an alliance because it clearly says that an attack against one of the these three countries will be regarded as an attack to the entire coalition, including Pakistan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. And for now, I would say yes. Recent Turkish foreign policy activism, indicates that Turkey, is trying to build a non-mutually exclusive diplomatic coalitions, in order to maintain or sustain stability and peace in the region, I would say. And I would say similar coalitions will also, of course, likely to, be established in other areas like South Caucasus as well, I would say, but we will see in the process.
Meanwhile, Turkey has enacted a new law setting out the next stage of efforts to end the PKK's decades-long armed campaign. The measures take effect once authorities confirm the group has disarmed. Adam Moro reports from Istanbul.
A new law setting out the legal framework for Turkey's ongoing effort to end a decades-long armed campaign by the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, has now entered into force. Late Monday, the law on strengthening national solidarity and social integration was published in Turkey's official gazette after being overwhelmingly approved by parliament last week. The legislation lays out measures that will be applied once Turkish security institutions confirm that the PKK and affiliated groups have ended their militant activities and surrendered their weapons. These measures include the suspension of ongoing investigations, prosecutions, and procedures related to the enforcement of prior convictions. The legislation covers a range of offenses, including formal membership in the PKK, knowingly assisting the outlawed group, and disseminating propaganda on its behalf. The new law also applies to crimes committed as part of the group's activities and offenses involving terrorist financing. President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan has welcomed the law's entry into force, describing its passage as an example of what he described as historic consensus. In a social media post, Erdoğan thanked political parties, lawmakers, and state institutions involved in what Ankara calls the terror-free Turkey process. The initiative was launched early last year after long-imprisoned PKK founder Abdullah Öcalan publicly called on the group to lay down its arms and voluntarily dissolve itself. The PKK's leadership, based in northern Iraq, later announced the group's readiness to disband. In a symbolic gesture soon afterwards, a group of PKK fighters in northern Iraq destroyed their weapons, marking the start of the disarmament process. According to Erdoğan, the next phase of the process will be carried out by the relevant state institutions and oversight bodies in line with the new legislation. This is Adam Maro for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
Uzbekistan is facing growing uncertainty over regional trade and transport links as the conflict in the Middle East continues to disrupt key routes. The potential economic impact is weighing on businesses and supply chains, as Sevil Rajapova reports from Tashkent.
Uzbekistan estimates that disruptions to trade routes through Iran caused by conflict in the Middle East could cost its economy between $1 and $1.5 billion. According to the country's fiscal strategy for 2027 to 2029, the potential losses would be equivalent to around 0.7 to 1% of Uzbekistan's GDP. The risks stem from Uzbekistan's reliance on Iranian territory as a transit route for international trade. In 2025, goods worth around $3.9 billion were imported through Iran, about 9% of Uzbekistan's total imports. That included around $1 billion worth of technological equipment, as well as food, chemicals, metals, vehicles, and pharmaceutical products. Uzbekistan also exported around $1.4 billion worth of goods through Iran, excluding gold. Textiles accounted for more than $546 million, while metals and metal products made up another $422 million. Officials warned that prolonged disruptions could increase transport costs, extend delivery times, and put additional pressure on supply chains. Higher global prices for oil, food, and fertilizers could add further inflationary pressure. At the same time, Uzbekistan is continuing to expand economic ties with Iran. Bilateral trade rose by almost 38% in the first half of 2026, reaching $305 million, while the two countries are discussing 29 joint projects. The figure suggests that while Uzbekistan's direct economic dependence on Iran is limited, disruptions to Iranian transit routes could have a significant impact, highlighting the need for alternative trade corridors as Tashkent seeks to strengthen its economic reliance. Sevil Rajapova reporting from Tashkent, Uzbekistan, A News.
Meanwhile, Pakistan is looking beyond its traditional Gulf oil suppliers as a disruption around the Strait of Hormuz exposes the risks of a concentrated energy supply chain. Its largest refinery, Synergico, is expanding purchases of U.S. crude. Mariam Zia reports from Islamabad.
Pakistan is looking to diversify its energy supplies as disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz expose the risks of relying heavily on Gulf routes. Synergico, Pakistan's largest oil refiner, is increasing its purchases of crude from the United States as Islamabad seeks to reduce its dependence on a single supply route. Before the conflict, around 90% of Pakistan's oil and LNG imports passed through the Strait of Hormuz. Synergico has imported about 8.1 million barrels of US crude over the past 9 months. Around 7.1 million barrels, worth approximately $750 million, were purchased during the fiscal year that ended in June. The shift has also contributed to a broader increase in Pakistan's imports from the United States. Payments for US goods rose by $914 million to $3.27 billion over the period, with Synergico's purchases accounting for around 80% of that increase. The refiner says it is considering additional spot purchases as well as longer-term supply arrangements. Further imports could be supported by a proposed US Exim Bank facility, which would allow Pakistani buyers to defer payments to US exporters for up to 3 years. For Islamabad, greater purchases of US energy could also help narrow its trade imbalance with Washington and support efforts to secure lower US tariffs. Pakistan is not abandoning its traditional Gulf suppliers. Instead, the shift reflects an effort to diversify its energy sources and reduce the risks associated with disruptions along a critical shipping route. Mariam Zia, A News, Islamabad.
Travelers between Britain and mainland Europe could have a new alternative to Eurostar in 4 years' time. It's after Virgin Train overcame another regulatory hurdle to launch cross-channel services. The move could bring greater competition to a market that Eurostar has dominated for more than 3 decades. Our correspondent reports from Manchester.
Britain's Virgin Trains is set to challenge Eurostar's long-standing dominance of passenger rail through the Channel Tunnel, potentially giving travellers more choice and cheaper fares between the UK and mainland Europe. The British company has been given approval by the UK rail regulator to run up to 20 daily return services from London to Paris, Brussels and Amsterdam. Eurostar is a high-speed rail operator connecting Britain with mainland Europe and has been the only passenger train company using the Channel Tunnel since 1994. But passengers will have to wait. Virgin's access to the railway network does not begin until October 2030, and it still needs access to European rail networks and safety approvals from regulators in Britain and the EU. The decision is another step forward for the project. Last October, Virgin was granted access to Eurostar's Temple Mills depot in East London, which is directly connected to High Speed 1, the railway linking London with the Channel Tunnel. Virgin says it plans to invest around £700 million in the project and create about 400 jobs. Its trains will run from London St Pancras to the same 3 European cities served by Eurostar. And there could be more competition. Trenitalia France has applied to run 10 daily return services between London and Paris from 2029, while startups Evelyn and Gemini Trains have also proposed international services. Virgin founder Sir Richard Branson has called for an end to Eurostar's 30-year monopoly and hopes to restore direct trains from London to Disneyland Paris. If the plans go ahead, passengers could eventually have more choice and potentially lower fares when travelling between Britain and mainland Europe. Zena Farizadeh, A News, Manchester, United Kingdom.
This concludes our news update for the hour. Thank you for watching A News and stay tuned for more.